President Trump's response to this pandemic has been a failure of leadership. So we are here today to provide leadership in the Senate to do what the Trump administration has failed to do. In April, my good friend, the senator from Connecticut, Senator Murphy, the two of us introduced legislation called the Medical Supply Transparency and Delivery Act. That act would force President Trump to take action and scale up American production of things like test kits, swabs, reagent, personal protective equipment, and the medical equipment needed at the local level to address the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic in our country. 3 months later, states still do not have the supplies they need. Now, more than 3.8 million Americans have been infected with the coronavirus, and tragically, over 141,000 people have died in our country. And for 3 months, our legislation has been in the majority leader's legislative graveyard. Since this public health crisis started, the Trump administration has had no national testing plan. And they've never had a plan to provide states with the testing supplies they need to combat this pandemic. As a matter of fact, last month, the president said we needed to slow down testing. And this weekend, as President Trump once again said the coronavirus would disappear, there were reports that the White House is trying to block federal funding for states to conduct testing and contact tracing. President Trump has not only abandoned each and every one of our states, he has also turned his back on frontline healthcare workers who continue to face shortages of personal protective equipment, including gloves, gowns, face shields, and masks. The Trump administration has created absolute chaos in the medical supply chain, leaving healthcare workers at hospitals and long-term care facilities at the forefront of this crisis to fend for themselves, rationing the scarce protective personal equipment that has been provided to them. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, Vice President Mike Pence, who was put in charge of our pandemic response, said the administration will be issuing guidance encouraging healthcare workers to reuse personal protective equipment. This is the same vice president who declared in April that the U.S. would have this coronavirus epidemic behind us by Memorial Day weekend. He was tragically wrong, and this White House continues to play catch-up on a pandemic and a virus that is spreading faster than ever. The person who President Trump put in charge of our medical supply chain was his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner predicted in April that by June we would be back to normal and that in July we would be rocking again. It's July. It's July, and this is where we are. Last Thursday, America had its highest number of new coronavirus cases in one day. And in my home state of Wisconsin, we had our highest case count ever yesterday. Yesterday. And we have many hospitals across my state with less than a week's supply of face shields, goggles, gowns, paper medical masks, and N95 masks. This public health crisis has not disappeared. We are not back to normal, and we are not rocking again. The fact is, President Trump has failed to lead, and this White House has taken us in the wrong direction in our fight against this pandemic. New coronavirus cases are rising in the states that we work for, which means we need more testing supplies, more testing, and more personal protective equipment for our workers. The question this Senate needs to answer is if we are going to let this president continue to take our country in the wrong direction, or are we going to lead and do what we all know needs to be done? Not one of my Senate colleagues can make an honest case that their state has everything they need to fight this pandemic. In Wisconsin, we've been shortchanged by this administration. They have failed to provide adequate supplies for our state's clinical and private labs, paralyzing our ability to expand testing to the level that we need. In some cases, what we have received from the Trump administration were unsuitable and unusable testing supplies, foam applicators that cannot be used for swabs, and saline tubes that were too short to transport swabs used in the majority of COVID-19 tests. In addition, the majority of labs conducting COVID-19 tests in Wisconsin are clinical or private labs. These labs cannot access resources from the administration and are essentially being told to figure it out. Over 80 Wisconsin labs that are currently performing tests do not have access to a consistent supply of reagent. We are not alone. States across the country have been abandoned by the Trump administration. They have been forced to go this alone, while President Trump has tried to pass off responsibility for his own failures. Every single one of us knows that our states need more resources and supplies so we can ramp up testing, identify those who are infected, isolate positive cases, and safely trace all contacts so that the spread of this virus can finally be contained. We all know that President Trump's broken supply chain has been a failure. And my legislation with Senator Murphy, supported by 46 Democrats, will help fix it. In order to put people back to work and safely reopen businesses and schools, we need both a national testing plan and the supplies to implement it. This is true in Wisconsin and every other state in our nation. Our legislation will help respond to this public health crisis and prepare for the future by mobilizing a federal response to increase our national production of the testing and medical supplies that we need at the state and local level. Specifically, the bill would provide critical oversight of the distribution of medical supplies and put an expert in charge to oversee COVID-19 equipment production and delivery. So we know we're putting science and facts over politics and private distributor profits when it comes to responding to this pandemic. And finally, our legislation unlocks the full authority and power of the Defense Production Act so that we can produce and deliver tests, testing supplies, personal protective equipment, and medical equipment that we need to take on this pandemic, treat patients, protect workers, open businesses and schools, and save lives. My friends on the other side of the aisle have a choice. They can continue to ignore President Trump's failure to respond to this public health crisis, knowing full well that until we confront it in the bold and effective way that we should, we will not solve our economic crisis. Or They can choose to liberate themselves from this failure and support a solution that will serve the people who sent us here to work for them. If my colleagues on the other side of the aisle believe that, as this vice president does, that this pandemic is behind us, then object. If my colleagues on the other side of the aisle believe that, as Jared Kushner does, that we are rocking again in July, then object. If my colleagues on the other side of the aisle believe, as President Trump does, that the coronavirus will just magically disappear, well, then object. If you oppose the failures of this president and this administration in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, then I ask for your vote to pass the Medical Supply Transparency and Delivery Act today. And so, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee be discharged and that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Bill 3627, the Medical Supply Transparency and Delivery Act. And I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Wisconsin.
Reserving the right to object, let me say first that I appreciate my colleague from Wisconsin's work on this issue. It's an important issue. It's one that our committee has been working diligently on. Since the beginning of the COVID crisis, we have held 5 hearings and a roundtable on exactly this issue, exploring and doing oversight on the national stockpile and their supply chain vulnerability. Just today, we marked up 5 pieces of legislation, very similar to what my colleague from Wisconsin is introducing here and trying to pass by unanimous consent. The 5 pieces are the Federal Emergency Pandemic Response Act, Securing Healthcare and Response Equipment Act, National Response Framework Improvement Act, National Infrastructure Simulation Analysis Center Pandemic, and finally, and this one closest to my colleague's bill, the PPE Supply Chain Transparency Act. It's actually the piece of legislation that got the most discussion. 2 amendments, including a second-degree amendment to one amendment, before passing unanimously. So our committee's done a lot of work. My concern about what my colleague is doing here, trying to pass this by unanimous consent, is by and large bypassing the committee process. It is true her staff reached out to my staff a couple weeks ago. We asked, have you vetted it through the department? Apparently she's begun that process, but this piece of legislation has not been properly vetted. It's not gone through the proper and full committee process. So again, without expressing opinion on a piece of legislation, but also acknowledging the fact that our committee has done a lot of work, passed 5 pieces of legislation on a nonpartisan basis today because we are concerned about this as well. Mr. President, I have to object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Wisconsin.
I am, of course, very disappointed that we cannot move this forward. And I wanted to respond to a couple of the comments made by my colleague from the state of Wisconsin, the chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. It is July. It is July, and cases are rising. Action was not taken in February, March, April, May, June, or so far this month of July. We had more than fair warning that we had shortages of masks and gloves and gowns and face shields and testing swabs and testing media and reagents. And yet it's July. As I said earlier, yesterday, Wisconsin announced the most cases positive for coronavirus in a single day that we've seen since the pandemic began. As we strive to reopen our economy, as the president exhorts all schools to hold 5-day-a-week in-person classes, we know the demand for testing, the demand for masks will only increase exponentially. The need to keep workers safe as they return to work, the need to keep customers safe as they enter and engage in commerce. To say that this needed to happen back in February is an understatement. I am pleased that my colleague has held hearings. This bill was filed in April when it became apparent that the president was not going to act. This bill was available for committee review since April. The House has passed many elements of the Medical Supply Transparency and Accountability Act in their HEROES Act, which they passed 2 months ago. And I just ask, where would we be today had this been put into law? There's been time to review, there's been time to study, but it is past time to pass the Medical Supply Transparency and Accountability Act. And I hope that we can create another opportunity for the Senate to act on this in the days to come, because it is so overdue. I want to again thank my colleagues who joined me on the floor this afternoon. My co-author, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, my colleague from Michigan, Debbie Stabenow, and my colleague from Ohio, Senator Sherrod Brown, and the 45 other members of the United States Senate who have joined me in sponsoring this bill.